Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture, and there's a lot to get on the docket today. It's been one hell of a recording session, and I also got the impression that it's not going to grab a ton of new attention outside of our final entry here, but hey, you're all along for this ride, right? Oh well, whatever. This is On the Pulse. Got 10 albums on the docket this week, well, kind of. Because we're starting with, from Spanish love songs, Brave Faces, everyone.
If you're not okay, but not okay is what's expected.
So, as some of you already know, I have already covered this in a solo review, which I encourage you to check out as soon as you can, but I'll also add you might want to get familiar with this real fast, because this could well be my album of the year, regardless of genre. A landmark in pop punk and emo, a generational gut punch. It is a band leaping from greatness into making an undoubtable mark. In other words, 10 out of 10. You'll want to hear this. But you know, while I'm on the topic of albums that are fantastic and I reviewed outside of On the Pulse, from Destroyer, have we met?
I like this. I'm on the lookout for anything that moves Crimson Tide.
Now this review's been out a little bit longer, probably should have shouted it out sooner, but I figured it deserved it all the same, as Dan Behar built on the icy synth tones and darker themes of his last album, Ken, for a more accessible, well by modern Destroyer standards, album. It's also goddamn fantastic, but every other critic has already said this, just worth for a good reminder. Light 9 out of 10, highly recommended. Next up from Caspian, In Circles. You know, I'll say one great thing for the On the Pulse format. It makes talking about instrumental post-rock albums a hell of a lot easier than trying to stretch out everything for a full-length review, especially when they're as generally underwhelming as Caspian is, who at their best had a sparkling heaviness that could be modestly appealing, but for the most part they've just been pretty derivative and wallow in fuzzy layers, underweight off-key crescendos, and a general lack of payoff. So, if you're a band stuck in an endless circle, why not make that the center point of most of your melodic cycles and the tacked-on lyrical themes? That's surely gonna redeem something, right? Well, no. Caspian remains a band that'll lock onto hazy, cyclical progressions and then forget to pay any of them off. It's genuinely alarming how many potential crescendos you'll just flutter out or lose steam as the melodic motifs are driven into the ground. Not helped by mixing that leaves so many of the guitars weedy and kinda tinny around the edges, even when they pick up tremolo swell, along with really rote drum work, underwhelming grooves, and extraneous instrumental passages that rarely shine the way they should, especially in that really ugly string section on Ishmael. And after listening to the full Caspian discography, 5 albums, look, none of them are outright bad, but with this, a project like this is clearly spinning its wheels, just becomes heavier than average nap music for me. Light 5 out of 10, not my thing. Next up from Thematic, Skyrunner. God. So, okay, on the one hand, it tends to be bad form as a music critic like me to come down really hard on a relatively unknown band that doesn't seem to have a lot of attention outside of a very specific scene. On the other hand, I checked out Thematic's 2014 debut, and they sound like everything I can't stand about modern prog metal. Way too long, really slapdash mixing, questionable songwriting, and some of the most ill-conceived song construction I have heard in months. I'll say this again, calling your music progressive, it's not an excuse to ignore any sort of hook or transition. To be blunt, it was bad. But I was reassured that their follow-up 6 years later was considerably better. And look, I guess it's better on production quality alone, along with embracing more melody. But if you're expecting the compositional instincts to have improved, I got real bad news for you. If anything, the presence of actual hooks this time makes this even more frustrating. Because against those liquid and bright guitars, you have groove sections that will often drop into math rock cadences and patterns that actively disrupt workable melodies rather than complement complementing them, and an utter inability to construct transitions leaves fragmented pieces of songs thrown piecemeal against each other with no blending or sense of consistent internal logic. Yeah, there are a couple impressive solos and anthemic passages. Shame there's nothing that built around them that creates a crescendo or a good build-up, and good luck having it feed into the next passage. And without that rise and fall or a sense of a dramatic arc, you've got a project where none of the standout moments are highlighted all that well, which flattens out your experience is the last thing you want on a prog metal album that of course is going to run long. And then when you couple that with some really frustrating synth choices, because of course that hasn't gone away, and a lyrical arc that's trying to split the difference between the cosmic and a more flowery brand of murky emo that doesn't come close to coming together or feeling consistent thematically. Irony. Yeah, I'm not gonna say Thematic is the worst example of all these issues in prog metal, but it certainly gives me no desire to come back to this. It ultimately just winds up kinda bland. Saxophone was nice though. Stream of Light 5 out of 10. Not my thing.
Next up, from Damone Tyrell, Numbers Don't Lie.
Said we so far from where we came from. We so far from where we came from.
So one thing that's going to happen with On the Pulse that you might as well get used to is me hijacking the schedule to insert an album or two that I want to talk about. And given that this project clocks in under 20 minutes and patrons have not been requesting enough hip-hop, get the hint, here's the newest project from Damone Tyrell, who, full disclaimer, I met in person in Atlanta back in 2017 at a show, and I might have gotten a little bit sloppier than I should have in our brief conversations. Sorry dude, I really enjoyed your company, but was kind of on vacation. Anyway, this is his follow-up to his 2016 album that I reviewed, and it's actually a pretty solid improvement. For one, the production is considerably more vibrant, leaning into watery guitars with traces of deeper soul and slightly rougher and better blended percussion that prioritizes the melody, to the point when the trap cadences actually slip in, they barely feel out of place and he commands them pretty well. And his rapped hooks, they actually do have a decent amount of punch behind them. And for the most part, I like the content as well, where there's been a shift from the more indecisive streak running through a lot of his debut to something leaner, a little bit more assertive and celebratory, but also considerably wiser and embracing some harsh truths along the way. Mostly in terms of balancing out his creativity that's not quite profitable in his hip-hop just yet, especially when his story might feel a little bit more regular, but also the drudgery of the career that he needs to feed his family, and that can sap that same creative energy. I've been there. And that maturity leads to a bit of a little brother vibe, and while Damone Tyrell's a little bit more brash with his punchlines, because he's young, he's still competing, it is naturalistic in a pretty good way, while being short enough to not wear out the welcome. I do have some issues. While I criticize the conceptual storytelling on his debut album, it was more because it made the album's arc a little bit unfocused, not that I wanted him to get rid of that. And it's not hard to hear the influences and flow, delivery, and production that made me wish he could continue to craft a slightly more unique identity for himself. His double time on the triple flows sounds real good. He could go more there. But as it is, nice improvement. Sets a pretty good vibe. I'm thinking it's a solid 7 out of 10. Check it out. Next up from Elay Arson, Dusk Incarnate.
Killer intent.
So I actually talked briefly about this production duo in my song review series on IGTV, at Spectrum Pulse on Instagram, sign up, but where they're working to fuse together some fuzzed out industrial metal with synthwave electronics. And while I thought the sonic fusion had a lot of style and some occasional punch, I got the feeling I had to wait for the album for things to fully come together, and now that it has, well, come together might be a bit of a misnomer, because while there is a larger concept for the album surrounding a super weapon implanted into a woman who's on the run in an 80s goth cyberpunk dystopian world, the fine details in the story are not really all that important in comparison with the splashy retro synths, the blasts of chugging guitars, and the lingering feeling that this album is missing a firmer low end or driving bass group to really back up the metal side. It's more an issue of mixed balance for me. A lot of tone saturating the highs and the mid-range, but the percussion and low end just doesn't have the same presence outside of the occasional gurgle and drum machine that tends to feel a little bit slow and not blend blended all that well, which is kind of a shame because Megan McDuffie playing the Dusk Incarnate character on Killer Intent does work a lot better on the album, especially given that she's got real bass presence and textured percussion to play off of. I'd certainly prefer more of that on the project instead of when this blasts into blaring chiptune tones or a thicker synth texture that oversaturates the mix where any guitar line sounds airless and smothered and most of the other vocals are shoved deeper in. Just leaves me grasping for the brighter melodies on Cocaine Nightmare because at least they got a slightly stickier tone and some sense of dynamics. But as it is, you know, if I say mostly instrumental industrial metal about an 80s synthwave cyberpunk dystopia, you probably already can imagine the tone and sound of the album, so it's not really that revolutionary. I just wish the mix balance was more filled out and there was any sense of distinctive atmosphere beyond the broad, splashy basics, because you've probably heard this before. Honestly, you'll probably dig it if you want more of that, but personally, I'm struggling to go back to it. Strong 5 out of 10. If you're curious, though. Next up, from HMLTD, West of Eden.
Luella, babe, won't you marry me now?
Alright, so we got a debut act out of the UK, leaning into more of an art rock sound, so I was gearing up for some killer grooves, a lot of flair, even though some of the buzz was suggesting that all the best songs had been singles that were already released, but I hadn't heard any of those, so going in blind, how to describe this? Imagine a frontman working his best 90s Nick Cave or Marilyn Manson impression, but against softer and higher budget production that's splitting the difference between, I don't know, Kieran J. Callanan going full pop and entirely too much splashy genre experimentation, cribbed from territories as varied as J-pop, psychedelic desert rock in the vein of Tropical Fuckstorm and maybe a bit of surf rock guitar, and even trap, all framed with a pompous artificiality to make you think it's all being ironic, only to raise your eyebrows when the band says that it's not. Now, it's absolutely camp, and kind of makes me want to slide them in the similar category as acts like Electric Six. Nothing wrong with that, but it makes them a little bit more bizarre that they've got a major label record deal and reportedly come from a lot more money than they preferred to admit, which might explain why there's a serious lack of truly subversive punk rawness and punch here, and kind of adds an asterisk to songs like Loaded. Now, all this tends to be an experience that at best can be described as kind of patchy, and way more impressed with its style and stagecraft than any sort of substance, which can be fine when the album is splashing into synthpop like Mikey's song, or going for gothic vaudeville melodrama like on Nobody Stays in Love and Satan, Luella and I, or maybe even the wonky elegance of Why, but it gets actively annoying when this album mostly fails to say anything outside of a clumsy update on Antichrist Superstar 25 years too late, with less groove, less originality, and it's got the approach of spraying apocalyptic imagery at the wall and assuming that's going to be death, alongside your obvious camouflage for post-breakup nihilism. Hey, we've all been there. And out of all that mess, just kind of winds up decent, if hit and miss. Enjoy the flash, folks, because I don't see them sticking around for long. 6 out of 10, if you're curious. Next up, from Against All Logic, 2017 to 2019.
Fucking kill him. If you can't do it good, do it hard.
And here I thought Nicholas Jar was only dropping the one album under his name under a house compilation, but something gives me the feeling he didn't quite expect that project to hit quite as widely as it did as a slice of gently updated, amazingly well-textured house. Seriously, even though it feels more like a scattered compilation, I got tremendous replay out of it. But now we gotta follow up a couple years later, stripping back more of the vintage soulful sounds to lean into the blown-out, shuddering distortion that plays a little closer to modern techno grooves than house, which I'll admit is the exact opposite direction that I'd like to see Nicholas Jar go in, as it's less melodic and less explicitly soulful, but it's not altogether surprising given his crossover credits in recent years, and again, he's touched in techno before. But it's also not just a pure pivot there, as there's also plenty of moments that seem to pull from his ambient works and his experiments with more texture and oblique melodic contrast, which leads to a more spare and dark album as a whole, where the vocal samples or organic touches are increasingly fractured against hazy synth patches and percussion across a whole scale of blown out scratchiness. And when you can look into some of the headspace of that tension, I'm not saying it's not weird, it is, but I certainly hear the appeal of it. Unfortunately, it does feel pulled simultaneously in about 3 or 4 different directions, which leads to some inconsistencies around the darker mood, and some tones get kind of annoying. and you got a very muted finale. But in other words, I do think it is pretty good, and on cuts like If You Can't Do It Good, Do It Hard, or Faith, or Penny, we get some great moments, but comparison with the last album falls a little short. Strong 7 out of 10 though, check it out. Next up from Roux, Supervision.
Now believe in you, gullible fool.
It feels kind of weird that it's been about 6 years since we got the last Roux album, but when you discover and remember that producer Ben Langmaid departed the duo before Trouble in Paradise is released, despite having some production credits, it left open the question surrounding where the hell Ellie Jackson would take this, reuniting with producer Dan Carey, now on an indie label. And when we got... sadly, not much of anything. Honestly, I'm a little bit shocked how small and rather cheap this album sounds, with damn near the same watery relic of the electric guitar imported from early 80s new wave. And while Ellie Jackson still sounds fine enough with a lot of multi-tracking against it, the grooves are just painfully underweight in the percussion and bass, and the lack of greater variance in tempo or melodic structure or tone really makes these 8 songs run together, and they already run long. That's where we get the rinky-dink keys and organ that only really work in the hints of atmosphere around the closing ballad. Now, this would be where I would run to the writing to find something that would stick out, but unfortunately, the somewhat coy push-pull of the album's relationship flirting feels weirdly less attractive against this production. It's kind of a shame, as Ellie Jackson's voice, it really is the best part of this album, but a lot of the writing feels oblique enough to attract my interest, but without much in the way of real payoff, or punch, or originality. Now, there is a part of me that really wants to like this and be generous. It is still catchy if you can get into these sounds. It's clearly trying to make the best of the limited budget and resources. I've been there. And it's at least consistent in the mood, but if this is a backwards looking shell of what Roux used to be, I just have little no reason to return to a rather undercooked sound. Light 5 out of 10, just not a lot here. But on topic of disappointments, next up from Green Day, Father of All Motherfuckers. No, hang on, that's not right. I was very plainly told this is the newest album from Foxborough Hot Tubs. What is this nonsense about a new Green Day album? But, setting jokes aside, what immediately struck me surrounding this project, besides the cringy marketing, was a get off my lawn meme that fellow critic Mike Seatown made on Twitter in response to Green Day. Kind of ironic, because at this point, Green Day are so indebted and borderline obsessed with rock's past that they could double as the person in that meme. And yet, while that's always been somewhat true, I've heard 21st Century Breakdown, that's what was once distracting in the 2000s is now starting to get actively draining and tiresome in 2020. Again, nothing wrong with pulling from the past so much as you can build on it, make something unique, not feel like a retread or awkward or overloaded with self-congratulations, which is where this stumbles hard. I made the observations before that Billy Joe Armstrong seems to have a bit of a Peter Pan complex going back to the trilogy, but it's on full display here in both his groan-inducing falsetto and the hypocrisy. You want to call out modern acts for sampling while you're Green Day and you've been lifting riffs from classic rock and punk for decades now, and even more so here with flagrant retreads like the Joan Jett lift on Oh Yeah and from Little Richard on Stab You in the Heart, most obviously, just comes with a lingering immaturity and a lack of subtlety that cements the evidence that Green Day's not aging well. Trying to pick up traces of adulthood, but none of that introspection or weight, which I know they've had in the past. And it gets even more ugly when you combine that with Butch Walker's increasingly rubbery, blocky, yet blown out production choices, especially in the leaden percussion lines and the horrible vocal mixing, all of which coalesce in the hideous clunker song Junkies on a High. And then you follow it with underweight and increasingly slapdash writing, trying so hard to relate to the kids and falling so very flat with cuts like I Was a Teenager. Billy Joe, did you somehow think that just because they were into retro, you'd get here 5 years late and win them over with this terribly mixed pastiche? Hell, in the case of Sugar Youth, you're ripping off yourselves. We remember She's a Rebel. I mean, the best thing I can say is there's a few really solid guitar lines, like the solo on Meet Me on the Rooftop, and the grubby, flattened garage tones of Take the Money and Crawl. But when it's juxtaposed opposite the awful backing vocal blending and the utterly self-indulgent choice to add crowd cheers to a couple songs, not the album to do that. And yeah, this isn't very good. It's not their worst while Dose still exists, but it's close. 4 out of 10, I can't recommend it, and Green Day, I'm a fan, but this ain't it. But yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. And hey, if you guys want to see the reviews for the first 2 albums that I covered today, where I talked about them at much greater length, links in the description as well. Those are full-length videos. I'd be happy to see you guys come around on those. I will be making standalone reviews when it's appropriate, like for those 2, because they are amazing. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you're looking to get albums on my schedule, link to my Patreon right over there. There's how you do it. Happy to see you guys get on board. But until then, I'm Mark. You're watching On the Pulse on Spectrum Pulse. And I'll see you next time.